Hello, hi, greetings, everyone. This is Volts for April 22, 2026. The big stories from the last year in electricity. I'm your host, David Roberts. Every year, the think tank Ember puts out its Global Electricity Review, a comprehensive look at electricity generation around the world, delving into which countries are getting power from which sources and how those numbers are shifting over time. Last year, I talked with them about the 2025 edition, which was fun and enlightening. So when the 2026 review landed, I thought I'd come back for an update. This year's report has some striking findings. Notably, global fossil fuel electricity generation fell in 2025, a rare event, and the first time I believe it's happened outside of a recession or an unusually mild weather year. Solar and batteries are continuing to boom. Countries like Australia and Chile are showing what truly green grids can look like in practice rather than in theory. And there's an interesting argument in the report about India, that it's unlikely to repeat China's coal-heavy development path for structural reasons. To dig into all of this, I have two Ember veterans with me today, Kostantsa Rangelova and Nicolas Fulghum, both returning guests, though this is their first time appearing together. I can't wait to geek out about all of this. With no further ado, Kostantsa Rangelova, Nicolas Fulghum, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
Hello, and thank you for having us.
Thanks so much for having us.
I just want to jump right in. Nick, I'll start with you about some things that haven't changed. You could just write this report every year and just say, hey, look, renewable energy is growing really fast again. So let's just start, Nick, with that, which is, I guess the same as last year. Technically, there's a couple of sort of milestones this year. Wind and solar combined met 99% of demand growth around the world. I just want to start with that first thing, because that's crazy. That's just like people need to wrap their head around that. Basically, all demand growth is being met by renewables. Solar was 75% of that demand growth, overtook wind in total generation for the first time ever this year. And I guess the other notable thing is that solar, despite several boom years in a row, has hit the highest rate of growth in 8 years, despite, of course, having a much, much, much larger base it's working off of. So I guess just tell us about renewables and the ongoing renewables story.
Like you say, it's some things never change, and it's difficult when you're writing these reports to not end up with a headline that says record solar growth. And indeed, there is a section in the report that does have that name still.
It keeps breaking records. What can we do?
It does keep breaking records. You can't not say it if it happens. So yeah, as you pointed out, we had this record-breaking solar growth in quite a few respects. So both in terms of the absolute growth, so 636 terawatt hours of solar generation was added in 2025. Just to put that into perspective a little bit, we're talking about twice as much as the annual electricity demand in the UK. So it's a huge amount of generation that's being added there. And in relation to the demand growth, it's 75% of the increase. Now, that's way more than any other source grew. The second largest growth came from wind at 205 terawatt hours, so about a third of the increase in solar. And then you already go down to nuclear power and to gas, which grew about 36 terawatt hours. So that's then 18 to 20 times smaller than the increase in solar. So
I'm very curious, which nuclear and gas, who's winning there? What are the relative levels there?
I mean, it's all within the margin of error. We have an increase in gas generation, 36 terawatt hours, and a nuclear increase of 35 terawatt hours.
Oh, roughly the same then.
Roughly the same.
That is, I mean, it's hard not to say that over and over again, because it really, I think it takes time, even if you hear that over and over again, to truly absorb the fact that renewables, in terms of new power generation, have won. They've won the game. That's 99%. 99% is renewables. And like, that is not because the entire world is gripped by, concern for the children of Bangladesh. It's just like incontestable now that this is the cheapest. Also, should mention this, Nick, before we get off this topic, renewables overtook coal, which I was surprised by because I thought coal had kind of had a resurgence in 2025. Talk about that a little. Is it just, it did have a resurgence and solar's was just bigger?
No, so we actually saw a small decline in coal generation in absolute generation for the first time in a while. So a drop of 63 terawatt hours. And if you combine that with the minor increase in gas and then another minor fall in other fossil generation, which is mostly oil, we actually end up with a small decline in fossil generation overall. So a 0.2% drop. And that's obviously the result of the trends that we've already mentioned of renewables and nuclear power together. So low carbon sources growing faster than electricity demand.
But all the hype about coal, like all the hype about how the war and everything is going to send people running back to coal, all that, it didn't show up in the in the numbers then.
Not yet in 2025. And we do expect that even if there might be a short-term switching of fuel sources. So it wouldn't really be an increase in fossil generation overall if there is a reaction to the recent conflict in the Middle East. It would be largely a switching from one fuel source, so from gas, for example, if it's too expensive to coal. But make no mistake there as well, that would be short-lived. And coal prices have also risen. So countries that are importing coal don't really have an amazing option in coal just on the side. It is very much you're choosing between two poor options. And I think it's best summarized in the words that Xi Jinping uttered the other day, where basically China was congratulating itself on having taken a renewables heavy development path in the recent years and the benefits of energy security that has brought. To hear that explicitly said from China, I think says everything about whether the future for energy security sits in renewables or it sits in coal.
I mean, it was a good idea for all the reasons he says in the first place, but then we go and just like really reinforce what a good idea it was. Just so there's no remaining doubt. Let's clear it up that was the smart thing to do. So I guess the last question about renewables is just how long could this go on? Where are we on the S curve? Do you think we're still just heading up on the S curve? Like, are we close to maturity? Should we expect again in 2026, 27? Like, how long can this surreal boom in renewables go on?
Well, as you noted, there's always the expectation that once the technology matures, that at least, you might stay with high absolute growth numbers, but usually your growth rates come down.
Right.
With solar, what we've seen is that 2025 had the highest percentage rate, so 30%, the highest rate in 8 years, which isn't a common feature, I would say, among technologies that reach maturity, even though solar is very much a mature technology in the market, obviously now.
It's wild.
Yeah.
I feel like I want more explanation. It's like, it seems like there's an element of magic involved. It is a mature technology. It is getting better, but not at the rate it was. It's just, it seems like more than the sum of its parts, I guess, is what I'm groping around toward.
Yeah, well, we're still seeing cost declines, even in the solar sector, in terms of installations, but then also just the total installation cost. So not just the panels, but the total cost, project cost is still coming down. Financing, this is not part of this report, but our colleagues just put out analysis showing that the upfront cost for solar power is now actually comparable with fossil fuels. And that's not including fuel costs, which are obviously significantly higher. So that obviously changes the game, especially for emerging economies where upfront costs are really important. Capital intensity means with high interest rates can really make or break a project. And solar really now is both competitive upfront and then in the operational cost is the clear winner because it doesn't have any fuel costs associated with it.
Yeah, the upfront costs were sort of the last resistance, the last argument against. Okay, so again, solar breaking records, renewables breaking records, solar and wind together, handling all new global electricity demand. Crazy wild. The other side of this happy story is batteries. Kostantsa, let's talk about batteries a little bit. Last year, I guess if I was going to characterize the report last year, the sort of tone was like, here they come. they're on the way. And it seems like
And
this
here
year,
they are.
and this year is like, here they are. So the report takes a closer look at two case studies, Australia and Chile, with regard to
Yeah.
batteries. Just kind of tell us, like, what is going on in those countries and why is it striking?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Chile and Australia are two examples where the amount of batteries being built in the country is significantly larger compared to its solar growth, that basically they can actually shift a lot of that additional solar with batteries to the evening. And the reason why this is important is that basically when you see a headline number saying, okay, new battery capacity added in 2025 was 45% greater than 2024. It reached 250 gigawatt hours. But it's very difficult to put in your head, like, is 250 gigawatt hours actually a lot? Is this a big number? Should we be happy about it? And then the way to think about it is, like, what do batteries actually solve? And this is very strongly linked to what Nick was just saying about solar, because solar being the dominant driver of growth in clean power basically means that with solar alone, there is some sort of an inherent limit where you build solar, but that solar generates electricity only during the day. And then there's the question, like, what do you do when the sun sets? Like the favorite question of so many renewable skeptics saying, oh, what do we do when the sun sets? So basically batteries help you bring that electricity into the night. And then the way we try to explain the size of batteries and that 250 gigawatt hours of battery capacity that was added in 2025 is that when you look at solar growth, so solar, as Nick said, increased by 636 terawatt hours. But this is like the electricity generated in 2025 versus 2024 across the year. But if you divide that by 365, this is like how much more solar was generated on the average day of 2025 compared to last year. And that number is 1.7 terawatt hours. And basically, with this battery capacity, you could take 14% of that and shift it to the night. And 14% is not that big, but it actually is big when you compare it. For example, it was 5% in 2022. So basically, batteries are really catching up to solar's explosive growth. And we were just discussing, like, solar is growing super fast, but batteries are managing to catch up to that. And now are at a size that can actually capture a meaningful percent of that additional solar and shift it to the night.
So just to clarify, you're saying that globally, batteries are growing faster than solar, catching up.
Yeah, they're managing to catch up. And the reason why we use Chile and Australia as two examples is that this percentage, like this 14% on the global level, in Chile, it's 76%, and in Australia, it's 53%.
Wait, 76% of the solar energy generated in Chile can be moved to nighttime by batteries?
The additional solar. So solar generation grew by 2 terawatt hours in 2025 compared to 2026. So this is basically how much of the solar growth in that year can be captured by the new batteries. So it's not the outright capacity of battery, which is still small, but it's starting to catch up. And then when you compare the additions on the battery side and the additions on the solar side, like, what can the new batteries do with the new solar? And more of the new solar can actually be captured with battery and shifted to the night. And Chile and Australia are both above 50%. 50% is a pretty important number, because when you are able to shift 50% of your new solar from the peak during the day to another time of the day, probably the evening when you have peak demand. Like, if you can shift 50%, this means that your midday peak would not grow. So basically your solar is not growing at its highest in the middle of the day. It's growing in the shoulder hours, so basically early morning, afternoon. And then 50% of that growth is happening in the evening, or whenever you like it to be, like whenever it's most needed. And Chile and Australia are both at a place where they can shift more than 50%, which means that more and more of that midday solar is actually moving to the evening where it's most needed.
And it looks like you get pretty striking effects from that, even at relatively low percentages. In other words, just like being able to move a little bit of the solar tonight gets you quite a bit. Like Chile has cut curtailment of solar by 80% just with that additional increment of batteries.
Exactly. So it was not estimated by us. It was the Renewables and Storage Association of Chile that estimated that the batteries added in Chile managed to avoid 2 terawatt hours of potential curtailment. And 2 terawatt hours, this is equivalent to the growth of solar in Chile in 2025. And it's more than 2% of Chile's total electricity demand growth. So that's like a huge amount of electricity that would have been curtailed, but wasn't thanks to batteries.
You know, it's funny. The last time I talked to you, Kostantsa, was about an Ember report that was about solar and batteries and how far they've come and how much they can cover now at a reasonable price.
Yeah.
And that was mostly in theory, right? We're just talking about prices and sort of doing the model, you know. So like the one thing I remember about that is that Las Vegas can get to like 90%, I think, solar and storage.
More than 90%. Yeah.
Economically today. But that was theory. This is reality. Australia and Chile are places where it's happening in reality. One of the questions I had is like, is it going to be possible for any country to get to 100% with solar and batteries? Because, you know, the conventional wisdom is that like batteries are too expensive. You can only get 4 hours. You're going to have your Dunkelflauts in your gray winters. You need giant thermal storage, you know, or you need firm power in the winter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Is all of that true? Is anybody going to be able to get to 100% on solar and batteries?
I'm really happy you're asking this question because this is something where a lot of the conversation has actually focused, where like, let's take a step back and say like globally, in terms of like what the solar share in 2025 was globally, was less than 9%, 8.7%. And the top countries, in terms of like the countries with the highest solar shares, like at the top of the ranking was Hungary this year with 27%. Chile was second with 25%. So these are the leading countries. And what batteries will change for solar now, which means that it will unlock shares that go beyond these, let's say 25, 27% was considered the limit without a lot of additional flexibility resources, and especially like shifting solar to the night was a very, very big problem for accommodating more and more solar growth, because there is just so much electricity demand that you can cluster in the middle of the day, and so much of the additional like sharing across different grids that you can do, especially if you're thinking about like many interconnected markets that all have solar and the sun sets all at the same time for all of these markets and rises at the same time. So what batteries do is that they get us from this 20%, 20 something percent, which is quite big, to something like 50, 60, 70% is starting to looking quite realistic. And this means that solar can keep growing at the record-breaking pace that we've been seeing for quite a while longer without us really worrying about this. And the reason why this is such a big game changer is that even when on the global level we are at 9% in 2025, some months it was 11%. So the record high this year for a monthly average was 11%. But on that month, like this solar was not delivered equally, and solar met a quarter of electricity in the middle of the day. So basically when the solar share is around 10, 11% across the day, it reaches a quarter in the middle of the day.
Interesting. And that's current.
Yeah, that's 2025. So basically we estimated that across the world, on average, in May, when the highest solar share on the monthly level was, solar was meeting a quarter of daily, like midday electricity across the world. And imagine like some countries like Hungary was at 90%. So for Hungary, the highest month for in terms of like the highest solar share on a monthly level was June. And then in that month, on average, solar was meeting over 90% of electricity in the middle of the day. And then you have large systems like Germany, for example, where it was, if I'm not mistaken, more than 60%, like more than 2/3. And you have Spain and you have the Netherlands, which are also at like similar level, like definitely over 50%. And then it gets so difficult to get beyond that because these countries, like Hungary was at 27%, like the top country leading the world in terms of like solar share in electricity, 27% across the year. But in June, 90% in the middle of the day. So I hope people are like seeing this limit that batteries can now help us break, because this midday share can stop growing. Even when 50% of the new solar is being absorbed by batteries, you can stop growing that midday share and increasingly put more and more of that solar in the evening when actually you need it more.
Yeah. I mean, I think these first two things that we've hit just in our conversation are, to me, the big macro story in the world of energy right now, which is solar, for a while now, has been the cheapest bulk electricity that you can produce. And that's just getting more and more so. Like the lead is growing, not shrinking. And so the only thing holding back solar has been, well, it only shines during the day. You have to be able to shift it. And like all of the hope for natural gas with CCS and nuclear and BECCS, space solar, all these cockamamie ideas are all circling around nighttime. Like, how do you get the power in the nighttime? And along come batteries.
Yeah, we solved that.
So we're like, well, okay, done.
Absolutely, we solved that. Like the remaining challenge is basically what you mentioned earlier, like the Duncan flautists and the longer periods of lower solar output. But the idea is that you're not supposed to be aiming for powering the whole world 100% on just solar and batteries. Like you can have a balanced mix, like throw in some wind in there, especially like if you look at India, like it's sunny in March, but then when the monsoon comes in July, you have higher wind. So definitely there's a lot of complementarity. You need to have like a balanced approach, like some countries have lots of hydro, or even you can use a little bit of gas as backup, like if it's 3% of the electricity across the year, like you're already like, I don't know, 90+% clean.
That would be a good problem to have.
Yeah.
Something I heard on another pod the other day, I can't remember where, so apologies to whoever it was, but basically the point was that 90% of the world's population is within 45 degrees of the equator. So the whole Dunkelflaut thing that we all obsess about and talk about all the time is a marginal problem. Like that's not, like you can get 90% of the world's population can do just fine, don't have Dunkelflauts. So like, again, like it's out there, it's a problem, but can we just go ahead and do the 90 that we know how to do? Let's just do that.
Yeah, and most of the electricity demand growth will be happening in these countries that don't have that problem.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that. The final battery fact I'll drop, and then we need to go to the next thing, which is just that battery pack prices fell 45% in 2025. Every time
to $70 per kilowatt hour. Yeah.
Every time I talk to you, we have one of these numbers, and every time it just causes my mouth to like, it's just not a normal experience for consumer products to drop almost 50% in price a year again and again. So just throwing that out there, in 2025, battery pack prices fell 45%. So whatever your estimate of what batteries could accomplish was a year ago, multiply it by 45% more, and then probably again next year. So just to throw that out there. So let's move on to the plateau issue. Probably one of the things that gets discussed most around these reports, people are modeling these things all the time, reports coming out for past 20 years, is just like, when's it going to peak? When's it going to peak? When's it going to peak? It's like we're slowing it down a little bit. Solar and wind are taking more and more of the incremental growth. When's it going to peak? When's it going to peak? Is it peaking now? Oops, we were wrong. It flipped back up again the next year, etc. So all of which is to say, it went down last year. So obviously, we'll only know the answer to this question with a little bit more distance and time. But in your sort of estimation from what you can see today, why did that happen? Is that just structural, or was there something about this year that was, bespoke, but that was idiosyncratic?
Yeah, like you say, I think the best peaks are definitely observed when they've already happened. People have been burned probably too many times on calling various peaks, including in 2020 when we obviously had a drop across all kinds of fossil fuels, not just in the power sector. And there were a few pieces that were saying that was the peak, and then it wasn't.
Well, there's this whole idea that like maybe post-COVID, we won't just go back to the way it was, and then we just did.
And then we sort of did. But crucially, we didn't in the power sector. And we've mentioned this at the beginning of what's the difference between this year where we're meeting all the demand growth with clean power to previous years where that's happened. So 2025 was the 5th year in this century where we didn't have an increase in fossil generation. And in the past, when this has happened, so think 2020, then we had the recession in the late 2000s. In 2009, we had a decline in fossil generation. Those years, they stick out. But the reason that we had a decline in fossil generation in those years is because demand growth was either really low or demand actually fell. And what makes 2025 so different is that we actually had really healthy demand growth. So demand went up 2.8%. The 10-year average is 2.7%. So very normal demand growth. And that's the big difference here.
Yeah, global GDP growth was 3.2%, which is normal, not a recession.
Yeah, very much in line with the 10-year average as well. And this is really what we're looking at when we're saying there's a structural difference here. When you look at the charts of the increases in solar, in other clean power sources, it's a nice curved line that just increases and increases and increases. What's much more volatile is the increase in demand from year to year. And that's what's going to make calling the specific peak quite difficult, is because last year, for example, we had an incredibly hot year. And crucially, it was much hotter than in 2023. So we had this acceleration in heat waves, and that creates a lot more cooling demand. 2025 was actually also really hot, but it wasn't an acceleration. So it doesn't have a net effect on demand necessarily. But obviously, we're moving back into an El Nino year in 2026, potentially. We might see new temperature records. So these fluctuations can affect demand quite a lot from year to year. We're talking about a whole percentage point, for example, that can happen.
So it's possible that next year fossil generation could go back up. It's entirely possible.
Entirely possible, but what's much more important is when we're looking at the structural trends. So if we look at just over the last few years, how much has clean generation grown every single year? And then we look at the same for electricity demand and we extrapolate those trends out, we actually see that clean power is now meeting the increases in demand, which leads to a flattening out of fossil generation. So no growth. This is what is the potential plateau.
Mm-hmm.
There's no certainties in forecasts. I think everyone knows that. But the most likely scenario at the minute is that we'll have a few years with probably some smaller increases, some smaller falls in fossil generation. But overwhelmingly, as we get towards 2030, 2035, the growth in clean power is going to be much larger than the growth in demand. And that's when we'll see fossil generation come down. There's various models out there. Some people know them from the International Energy Agency, from Bloomberg, NEF. There's various scenarios, but generally they land at fossil generation 10% below 2025 levels in 10 years, or 20% below 2025 levels. So in that's sort of the realm that we're in. Now, some people might say we need much stronger declines, 10% in 10 years. That's absolutely nothing. And it's a very fair point. We're definitely, if you come at this from more of a climate perspective, that's not the reductions that we would expect.
Yes.
But it's important to say that the power sector is also playing a dual role here. So it's not just about decarbonization in the power sector. Part of what that demand growth is doing, and we're thinking about demand growth we're in these projections, demand is not growing at 2.7% like it has done in the last 10 years. It's growing at 3.5% per year. So more than it did this year.
So the acceleration in electricity demand,
yes,
driven by data centers, electrifying cars, heating and cooling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's global. That's global and enduring, you think?
Yeah, there's very clear signs. We've put some of the analysis in the report, looks at electric vehicles, where it makes up still single-digit percentages of the demand increase every year, but it's a pretty substantial amount. But there is a flip side, a positive flip side to it. Every terawatt hour of additional electricity demand is offsetting oil demand in the transport sector. And so this is what I mean with the dual role of the power sector, is that it's not just about decarbonizing electricity generation. We're also moving so many processes in the rest of the economy into the power sector, which is a very positive effect. So if we didn't have electric vehicles, if we didn't have any data centers, if we didn't have electric arc furnaces or heat pumps, then fossil generation in the power sector would fall quicker. But the trade-off is worth it, because the emissions reductions outside the power sector that we can achieve are actually higher than purely just cutting emissions as fast as we can.
This the whole premise of the podcast you're on. That is the
Exactly.
core premise here. So I want to just ask another question about the plateau. So the way you're describing this, it's often called a bumpy plateau. The idea that like we're in a little period here where we're going to be kind of wiggling back and forth before the sort of enduring declines start. And this is something people have been predicting for a while. The way you describe it is, it's like if I'm driving on the interstate going 70 and I'm passing a car going, 65, whatever, we might sort of like waver a little bit as I'm passing, but I'm steadily passing and I'm going to get past. That's kind of how you're describing what solar is doing now to fossil generation. Like we're wiggling now, but basically it's going to be a few years and then we're going to be past. There is a sort of theory out there that there's something sticky about the plateau, that we're going to be stuck on the plateau. I've seen lots of models that say this. I don't really know why we would be. And there's also this theory out there, which I'm sure you've seen, Vaclav Smil, I think, is associated with this idea that we don't have energy transitions. We only have energy additions. So we're still burning wood, et cetera, et cetera. We're still using coal. We just add these new sources and these new kinds of energy on top of existing ones. So that theory would tell us that we're not going to get enduring declines. So it seems to me, at the very least, if you get a decline, you're refuting that theory. I'm just curious what you think about, like, how long is this plateau, and is there anything to that energy addition point? Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who change majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts. People using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. So that theory would tell us that we're not going to get enduring declines. So it seems to me, at the very least, if you get a decline, you're refuting that theory. I'm just curious what you think about, like, how long is this plateau, and is there anything to that energy addition point?
Yeah, it's an interesting theory. I think the point that's often made within that is that we're still using as much biomass as we were 200 years ago. And that was obviously, in theory, that was an energy technology that was surpassed. What I would say is, I think it doesn't hold up with the reality of the energy system, because biomass wasn't actually surpassed as an energy carrier in a lot of applications, because we still have areas that use biomass for cooking because that's the available fuel there. Right. So the reason there has been this like consistent energy addition in all of these areas was because other fuel sources were still maybe easier to procure or easier to use in those contexts. But I do think that qualitatively we do have a difference in the transition that we're seeing here, because the substitution is not from, cooking with biomass to heating our homes with coal and then moving on to electricity produced by coal and gas and so on. We're directly switching from one form of electricity generation to another form of electricity generation. And that new form, solar, wind, batteries, is economically more viable and is already displacing it. So on a global level, we have this like slightly smoother trend.
And the fuel source is always accessible to everyone.
Exactly.
Everywhere.
Yeah, and that's why we actually expect emerging economies to, at some point, travel faster than economies that might still have a huge stock of fossil fuel infrastructure. So the parallel to this like addition model, I think only holds up so far when you look at the global level and historical trends. But in individual countries, we already see that there isn't addition happening. We see substitution in a number of countries. We see substitution in Brazil. This year, we saw some substitution in China. China is so big that you can kind of take it as almost a global number where it will probably plateau. But in the European Union, there's plenty of substitution happening already. So if the theory is only applicable at the global level, I don't think it's necessarily a good theory to predict what's happening at the country level. And what I would describe it as is essentially we're running out of countries that are going to significantly grow their fossil generation.
The final thing on the plateau is just the US in 2025 kind of lurched the other way. Coal generation was up 13%. I don't think net fossil generation was up in the US. I think we just did gas to coal because gas got more expensive for a bunch of reasons. Is that just a blip? I mean, is there anything to say about that other than it's probably just an anomaly?
Yeah, we had a very small increase in fossil generation in the US still, even with that switch back from gas to coal. But even in the US, where you had really strong demand growth in 2025, really cold winter temperatures at the beginning of the year, which pushed up demand as well. But even in the US, which obviously politically is, if anything, moving away from support for renewables, they still met 3/4. So solar and wind still met 3/4 of the demand increase.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you're looking at the US numbers over time, does Trump policy show up yet in the numbers?
I would say not quite yet. What it will likely show up in is that the additions in solar and wind that we could have been seeing in 2027 and beyond will probably be lower. So that we get the unfortunate counterfactual where that disappearance of support and the active, in some cases, obviously cancelling of offshore wind projects that are in process is not going to encourage faster deployment. But if anything, it says something to the durability and the economic viability of solar and wind that they're still seeing such huge growth in the US. I mean, the most liberalized markets in Texas are choosing solar and wind actively.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, the other big topic this year is India, which I think is really interesting. People in our world talk a lot about China for obvious reasons. China is the number one in choose your metric. But India is important, got a lot of people, quite big, growing quite fast. I guess the macro worry has always been that emerging economies are going to follow China's path, i.e., develop with coal and then once they've achieved some measure of prosperity, slowly transition from coal to renewables. And I think if you run the numbers on that model, if that happens, we're all screwed. But it looks like maybe it won't, India being the case in point. So maybe one of you can tell me, like, what are the signs? Why would we believe that India isn't going to follow China's? What are the counter indicators, I guess?
I'm happy to start with the sort of structural perspective, and then Kostantsa might be able to add something really interesting about batteries here as well. So we obviously, a lot of people are familiar with China's growth story, huge increase in electricity demand, huge economic growth. And as a result, there was a huge increase in coal generation as well. So a lot of that growth was fueled by coal generation. This isn't just a China story. This is also the global story. So over the last 100 years, when we wanted more electricity, most of that electricity came from fossil fuels.
Yeah, I shouldn't blame China. It's also the U.S. model and the rest of the developed world model.
Yeah, exactly. So you had, every time there was a huge increase in demand, you had an increase in fossil generation. The reason that happened is because those were the available sources of electricity. You then had nuclear power, and hydropower obviously also play a big role, but a huge amount. So for example, if we look at just 20 years back to 2005 to 2009, 5-year period, in that time, fossil fuels make up 75% of the growth. So it was just kind of the environment that China had its big growth spurt in. Now, when we look at India, what we've done is we've compared their development level, if you just take it as their GDP per capita. And India's GDP per capita crossed $10,000 in 2025. That's the same level that China had 15 years ago. And since those 15 years ago, obviously, a huge explosion in coal generation in China. And we do expect India's electricity demand to continue growing. So the question then was, are we just going to see the same again? But the big difference is now wind and solar and batteries are price competitive. They're already the cheapest forms of new electricity in India. And on top of that, India's economy is actually significantly more efficient for how much electricity you need for your unit of GDP. So that means India's growth is just simply also not going to create the same increase in electricity demand that we've seen in China.
Is there a simple explanation for that? Why is that?
Yeah, the economy is more service sector focused. It has a growing industrial base, but it's just not as energy intensive. So that means you can grow your GDP per capita without having an enormous increase in demand, even though the demand growth rates themselves are still quite high. But yeah, we already see the increase in coal generation slow down in India. In 2025, we actually had a fall. Now, that had a few reasons. On the one hand, it was a huge increase in renewables, more than twice as large as the previous record increase. New increase record for solar, new record for wind as well. So 100 terawatt hours of additional renewables generation almost in 2025.
Lots of growth in coal too, though, right? I mean, it's all growth.
Not in 2025.
Oh.
So in 2025, coal generation fell in India by about, I think, 2.9%.
And is that structural?
So half of the structural part is this renewables record increase, which comes from capacity deployment. The other half is that 2025 was an incredibly mild year compared to the previous year, so particularly during the monsoon period. And that means slow demand growth. And as a result, that huge increase in renewables was enough to surpass the increase in demand, and we see a fall in fossil generation. But that indication still tells us something, and it's that India's coal generation growth is slowing down already.
The other number to throw in here is that coal has grown 46% in India over the last decade. So this halt in growth this year is quite notable. It's a very big deal.
Yeah, very much a reversal of the previous trends.
I feel like I have to jump in at this stage because I think this is where we need to really talk about the role of batteries and solar, because India has actually seen a very big increase in terms of auctions that are happening for solar and battery projects and for battery standalone projects. And the reason is basically, if you look at 2025, India, on the average day, around a quarter of its electricity was coming from solar in the middle of the day. This means that this big increase of solar in the middle of the day kept coal power from increasing during those hours. But outside of daylight hours, coal power kept increasing at pace with demand, which means that it was still around 3/4 of total demand in 2025 in those dark hours. But with batteries, you can now start squeezing solar more and more into those dark hours and meeting a lot of that additional demand with renewable electricity and not just coal. And being able to stop that coal growth, not just in the middle of the day when solar is growing, but also in the dark hours, really change the game and unlock a different level of growth for renewables as well.
Is India enjoying the cheap solar and batteries that China is producing? They're not putting tariffs on those things, are they? Is part of the reason that solar and batteries are growing so much in this part of the country that people are just kind of enjoying China's overproduction?
Certainly. So what we have seen is that the kind of battery prices that developers in India could have access to is probably around $120, $125 per kilowatt hour, which is extremely cheap. And that's for the full project to get developed. So certainly they do have access to those cheap batteries. They actually do produce, for example, parts of it, especially the energy management system, at quite competitive costs to China as well. So they do have some homegrown aspect of that as well. So it's not the full system being imported. And they are growing that manufacturing base as well.
And then on the solar side, India has actually actively brought solar manufacturing in country. So a lot of the manufacturing for panels is now done directly in India, and projects that use domestically produced cells do have certain incentives to go along with that. So it's It's really a full energy economy effort to bring that in-house. And if we just look at what it's done, is we expect that the coal generation per capita, they're very similarly sized countries on a population basis, China and India, but per capita, that coal generation is already stalling out at about a quarter or a third of the level where China has gotten to. So we just simply don't expect India to turn into the next China because that deployment for renewables is already so high, and already what's in the pipeline now. So already projects under construction. This is not announced or some future dream. These are projects that are already actively being worked on, are already enough to satisfy 2 additional years of India's demand growth. And there are certainly more projects that will be added in the near future.
I actually read a prominent DC pundit say today that India should transition from coal to US liquid natural gas because that would be lower carbon intensity. That seems totally crazy to me. Is that in fact totally crazy? Like solar and batteries. Like if you're going to build a new power generation plant in India today, is solar and battery already cheaper than natural gas?
Yes, certainly. This is not going to be in the Global Electricity Review, but we recently worked on a piece looking exactly at that. And of course, it was a very thought experiment kind of calculation saying, okay, what percentage of its electricity demand could India meet with only solar and batteries, theoretically? But yeah, what we saw is that you could get to around 90%, and the LCOE of the solar battery configuration that you needed was around $56 per megawatt hour, which is actually quite cheap. And I don't think LNG could easily compete with that.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, the last few weeks have shown that the general advice should be if you can actively avoid not tying yourself to a
Yes,
global
I
energy
know.
market, then you should definitely take that
for
route.
sure.
That was my first thought when I read that. I was like, really? You're trying to sell this to India right now?
Yep.
It seems like we're having a really lurid demonstration of what happens when you're dependent on other countries for fossil fuels. Okay, so India is just then seems like a positive story. What could go wrong? Like India seems at this point kind of aligned, like the economics are working out really well. It kind of seems like policy-wise, not perfect, but they are subsidizing solar. And so like everything kind of seems like it's moving the right direction in India. Is there something that could go wrong?
I would say not necessarily in India, but if we say globally, okay, we have, China is not just turning, but it is in absolute terms the global leader in clean energy build out. That used to be the biggest contributor to fossil generation growth globally. Since 2018, actually, outside of China, fossil generation globally has been flat. And now it's flat in China as well. I think those are the 2 things that people need to remember. That's why the global trend has now flattened out, because the biggest driver has turned. And we have seen the trend switch in India as well. We'll still probably see a few years up until sort of 2030 where we'll see fossil generation increases, but they'll be smaller. But then the question is, okay, if those big countries, the big contributors to the global fossil generation growth, if they're turning, who's left, right? Where is fossil generation growth going to come from?
Right. One of the really interesting things to me going on globally, like as we say, everybody talks about China, everybody talks about America, a lot of talk about India, but like one of the more interesting stories going on in renewables is a lot of these little countries that like you just wouldn't guess. If you were just like stop someone on the street and ask them to guess what country is booming in solar, a lot of these countries are not top of mind. So like Pakistan, I did a pod on Pakistan. Everybody's talking about the Pakistan story. They went, I think, from like basically 0 to 20% of their net generation being solar in like 2 years or something crazy. Brazil, as you say, is surging. Hungary, like what? Hungary? Why? I don't know. Hungary, Chile. So before we talk about the countries that haven't yet lurched in this direction, is there a common thread to those? It just seems like a very random grab bag of countries. Is there some logic there that I'm missing? Like, why are some emerging economies going gangbusters for solar and some aren't yet?
Yeah, I mean, the most straightforward answer is economics. Solar power is cheap enough, was at least significantly cheaper than the cheapest fossil fuel alternative that it is, especially for countries that either want to meet load growth or have trouble meeting their current electricity demand. It becomes a very obvious option to turn to. And Pakistan is certainly like the biggest example.
But that's true everywhere, and the boom is not everywhere. So I'm wondering, like, why boom some places and not others? Do we know?
I mean, urgency matters as well. So in Pakistan, the rates from the grid were so high, coupled with supply issues, that people took it into their own hands. So the solar boom that we see in Pakistan is very much one of distributed solar rather than utility scale installations. There's some utility scale solar as well, but a very large majority of that solar that's come online in the last 5 years has been from rooftop solar installations that people put down themselves, increasingly aided by battery installations as well. And so that availability, or this like very commodity driven approach to solar where people go out and they purchase their own solar panels, does have scaling power. You can't build your own little gas power plant, so naturally that's not an option. And historically that would have been maybe a diesel generator. Nigeria is another example, but the fuel costs for those in a lot of countries are simply too high. So Nigeria tended to be a country with a huge amount of off-grid generation from diesel generators, so smaller generator units. But the fuel subsidies, that people always forget that there are still a huge amount of fossil fuel subsidies out there. Those were reduced, and oil prices were too high once they weren't subsidized. So people naturally then turned to supply their own electricity with solar panels because they are cheap, easy to install, and readily available. We've seen the same thing in South Africa a few years ago when there was load shedding because coal power units weren't available. People immediately turned towards faster solar installations. And then much more recent examples, these are maybe countries that people are more familiar with when we're talking about solar. The drive to install distributed solar in Germany has just picked up again. The interest in rooftop installations has spiked significantly as a result of the second fossil fuel crisis in 4 years, as well.
Yeah, I don't know how many times Germany needs to learn this lesson before.
Yeah, exactly. The UK is the same. So a lot of countries walk through this path at maybe a different pace, but every single time there's a supply crunch, there's a price crunch among fossil fuels, the obvious option, because it is readily available and it's not a solution that you have to implement over 10 years with a huge project, solar is just so readily available.
Is there a story about Hungary? Like, what the heck's going on in Hungary? This is not a country that, like, politically, we tend to take as a model in other respects. What is going on there? Why are they having such a boom?
Yeah, I think in the case of Hungary, I think there was certainly a government subsidy support element to it as well that actually aided this like extreme boom. But what also helped was the fact that it's a very interconnected system within Europe, which means that like sharing that electricity across the European grid made it easier to reach like a very, very high share without necessarily having, for example, battery to accommodate that.
They're not an island, they're well interconnected.
Yeah, exactly. And they could share, like, for example, very high midday shares with other countries. So it was relatively easy to achieve for a very well interconnected country with in terms of the electricity grid.
The flip side of this, in a really interesting point or argument the report makes, is that the remaining countries that still have really high percentages of fossil generation, that are still stuck on fossils, basically, are almost all in extremely sunny places. So
Right.
what are the implications of that?
Yeah. So we've looked at countries that have had increases in fossil generation over the last 4 years, so between 2022 and 2025. And when you look at their irradiation, so how much solar insolation or how much sunlight they get per year, they're really almost exclusively significantly above the world average. So there are lots of countries where fossil generation is already declining, and they're more spread out. So you have Germany, even though they have a lot of solar, so there's a lot of mixed countries going on there. But if you're looking at countries that have had fossil growth below 3% per year, so that includes countries like China, for example, they tend to be already a little bit sunnier. But then the ones that have been growing the fastest in fossil generation, so more than 3% per year in the last 4 years, that includes Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, India, Egypt. And those are countries that are significantly, especially countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, are countries that are significantly higher in terms of their sunshine that they receive every year. Just to pick out Egypt to explain what's going on here. So we have a country like the Netherlands, which isn't very sunny. Egypt gets about twice as much irradiation per year than the Netherlands get. But Egypt has 4% as much solar generation per capita as the Netherlands do.
Almost none, then, it sounds like.
Almost none. And so what we're looking at here is potential, right? So another way to maybe get the scale across is that Australia's solar generation per capita is higher than Egypt's electricity demand per capita. If the question is, can solar generation scale to the level of a significantly sized economy? The answer is yes. And the even better answer is that all of those countries still growing their fossil generation because they're using that to meet their growing demand, they are in sunny regions. We're not having to find solutions to the demand growth in the Netherlands. And funnily enough, the Netherlands are now meeting a reasonable amount of their demand with solar. It's one of the highest solar per capita countries in the world behind Australia. Australia's the number one, and then you have the Netherlands in the second spot. So even the countries with low irradiation are turning towards solar. So it's even more of an obvious solution for those that do have all of that sun.
So a question about that particular group of countries. First, is there like they're going against the tide here, against the economic tide? Is it just politics? Like, is there a common thread in those countries, or is it again sort of bespoke from country to country why they're still expanding fossil fuels rather than already opting for this cheaper option?
Yeah, so it's definitely slightly different country by country, but we do see in aggregate, we do see a bigger drive towards solar, especially in the more recent years. So one of the ways that we're tracking this is we're looking at the exports of solar panels from China. China is responsible for more than 80% of solar panels produced in the world. So looking at their exports tells us a lot about where the next big pickup in solar is. That's how we kind of spot Pakistan and those stories. And the panel exports went up 48% to Africa from 2025 to 2024. So it's now 19 gigawatts in 2025, which doesn't sound like a lot, but you have to remember that electricity demand in Africa is also still relatively low. Egypt, for example, imported twice as many panels as they did in 2024. So that's now 2.3 gigawatts. And then some of the countries that grow have the most fossil generation growth over the last few years. Saudi Arabia, for example, is actually now a country that's heavily investing in renewables. We have over 10 gigawatts of
They're going for it.
installed capacity now in solar. We have huge tenders, so another 15 gigawatts of renewables capacity that were tendered in 2025 alone. So we are going to see a really rapid turnaround. Oman, United Arab Emirates, Qatar.
Right. So even those countries have sort of gotten the message and are pivoting now. Are there countries left that aren't pivoting, that aren't, sort of ramping up their solar, that are still doubling down on fossil fuels? Is there any country that's just like, screw all this, we're sticking with fossil fuels, that hasn't started changing course?
Well, before I get to the one really big one that hasn't, I'm going to say one more positive thing before we get to the big one that just isn't turning. If we take all the countries where we have growing electricity demand, but all the countries that are meeting less than 50% of that demand with clean power over the last 4 years, so those are the ones where you would say most of that growth is still coming from fossil fuels. That's only a quarter of growing demand in the world. All the other countries, China, US, Brazil, Pakistan, they're meeting more than 50% of their demand growth. Actually, a lot more in the case of China. It's 75%. In the case of the US, it's over 80%. Pakistan is meeting more than its demand growth with clean power sources. Brazil is doing the same. So those remaining countries are actually only a small part.
In absolute terms, the holdouts are not a huge deal.
Exactly.
If anything, this is going to accelerate because with the current gas and oil price crisis, this will only get even more prominent. And
Yes.
we saw Indonesia announcing a goal to add 100 gigawatts of new solar capacity within 3 years, which is huge. And Indonesia is one of those like very sunny countries with, until recently, growing fossil growth. So certainly we can probably expect an acceleration with the current situation.
All right, Nick, to break the suspense, who's the final the final scofflaw standing?
Well, yeah, Indonesia is the one that is just now turning, but Russia is the big holdout.
I should have known. It should have been my first.
I guess the one positive thing about, I don't want to say the positive thing about Russia, but essentially demand growth is relatively muted. The economy is not, expanding at a rapid rate for various reasons. But in terms of countries that have a huge amount of fossil generation, certainly one of the big holdouts. We've not seen the power system budge any which way over the last more or less 2 decades. A huge amount of coal and gas generation still on the grid. They also have nuclear and hydro generation, but it's essentially a huge stock of fossil generation that doesn't seem to be going away. Solar and wind still at around 1% of generation, which, if you compare it to other countries that have a similar level of GDP per capita, is one of the lowest values globally. So it's being significantly outperformed by Saudi Arabia, which I feel like historically people wouldn't necessarily call a renewable state. So we're really talking about one of the largest power systems in the world that doesn't really have any signs of turning anytime soon. But luckily, as we said, most of the countries with growing demand are meeting all of that growth with clean power. So if we're talking on a global level, we are definitely running out of countries that could drive fossil generation up.
Yeah. Still, like most of the big oil and gas producers refuse to implement policies to cap or reduce production. But even those countries are pivoting their own consumption to clean energy, like Saudi Arabia, Norway, all these examples. I think Russia might literally be the only country that's like, screw it, we're going fossil fuel on both sides. Probably not going to work out great. So as a final question to you both, what are you looking for next year? What do you think next year's report is going to contain? Probably solar's going to break another record. So I'm going to take that prediction off the table. It's too easy. I guess, like, what are you watching? What sort of trends are you watching? What do you think will be of interest next year, in the next 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I will definitely be watching the battery space, as always. I really think that we are probably going to have a very big pickup in batteries in countries that have had this like bump in solar, and batteries will follow. Thinking Pakistan or similar countries that have gone that path. And even, I would say, countries that are very early in their solar journey might also be adding lots and lots of batteries and show that this can actually meet demand across the day and any time. So I'm definitely looking at this, unstoppable force kind of message next time.
Yeah, and tell me if you agree with this. It seems like even relative to solar, there's still technologically a lot of runway left to improve batteries' performance and price. Like, they're still going to get way, way better and cheaper than they are today. So
yeah, I wouldn't bet on a similarly huge, like this 45% price drop we saw 2025. I would be surprised, but I would be happily surprised if it happens. But considering that we have this like lithium price pressure currently, we might see a slowdown. We might still see like a price drop on the battery side, because this is not just driven by like lower material costs, but also by improving manufacturing efficiency in terms of improving project level efficiencies and things like that. But probably a milder decrease, because we're already at the level where batteries are really, really quite competitive. But yeah, I would probably be betting on scaling on the deployment side and a mildly good number on the price side.
interesting. How about you, Nick?
We're getting to a point where the level of renewables deployed in some countries is now kind of fundamentally changing how those power systems operate. And there are some really exciting dynamics that are happening here. Like, one of the sizes of obviously the battery story. We're always watching some of the leading systems like Australia, like California, where we're now seeing, some of the shoulder hours or evening peak demand batteries reaching 40% or more of the demand being met during those hours. So I think we're seeing a completely different way that the power system can operate. And on the very positive effects that can have, during this crisis that we're seeing now, gas prices are high again, coal prices are high again. The countries that have had the largest build out of solar and wind power over the last 4 years are the ones that are suffering the least now. In Europe, a big comparison that we're pointing towards at the minute is between Spain, which has a lot of solar and wind and has installed a lot of solar and wind, and Italy, which hasn't to quite the same extent and is still relatively reliant on gas. If you look at what wholesale prices for electricity have done over the last 4 weeks between the two countries, in Italy, they're at times more than 5 times higher than in Spain. And that really is wild. Almost like a non-linear relationship. So it's not like you add 10% more solar and you get 10% lower prices. If countries don't move towards a system where their energy and their electricity is domestically produced, like solar and wind can provide, then you are going to be increasingly reliant again and again on these crisis-ridden fossil fuel markets where if coal goes up, if gas goes up, if oil goes up, your wholesale electricity price is directly on the hook for that. So this is a dynamic that has driven countries like Indonesia to say, from a relatively low base, there's not a lot of solar deployment currently in Indonesia, to say we're going to install 100 gigawatts in 3 years.
That's wild.
Yeah. And note on the 100 gigawatts in 3 years, that's a promise that you couldn't make about any other electricity source.
Absolutely.
Even if you wanted to. You couldn't say we're going to install 100 gigawatts of gas-fired power plants in the next 3 years, or nuclear.
Well, you can say whatever you want about nuclear. Let me tell you, after 20 years of this, you can say a lot of things about nuclear, but you cannot build 100 gigawatts of it in 3 years.
And this is what I mean with when we were talking about Nigeria, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, South Africa. The availability does make a big difference. We have a lot of technologies converging at the same time. Batteries are solving the flexibility problem. The increased manufacturing of solar panels in India, in China, means that the supply of solar panels is relatively secure. Even the US has domestic supply of solar panels still.
And batteries.
And batteries, yeah. So the convergence of all of these technologies at the same time means that we basically now see a breakout of solar and a breakout of solar and batteries in a country now every other month. And that's just a really exciting development to watch. And I'm excited to see what that means in aggregate for next year. But it's definitely going to be another busy year of tracking these trends.
Yes, it's unfortunate that, these global convulsions and wars and everything are going on. But boy, they really do seem like they might as well have been scripted as a warning about fossil fuel addiction. I mean, you couldn't script it anymore. The lesson seems quite obvious. Thank you both. This is always so interesting. And this, I'm struck again and again. All this stuff is moving so much faster than most people understand. It's just wild. So thank you all again for coming and keeping us current.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.